And March 23, 1943. Inside the stifling 110-degree steel hull of a Panzerkampfwagen IV, a German tank commander wiped the stinging sweat from his eyes and pressed his face against his Zeiss optics. In Sawan. Through the heavy heat shimmer rising off the floor of the Tunisian desert, he watched the American defensive lines taking shape in the distance. To the veterans of the German 10th Panzer Division, and the men digging into the dirt ahead of them, were not a genuine military threat. They were prey. Just 1 month prior, the German Afrika Korps had annihilated the United States Army at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. It had been a slaughter. Green, untested American units, overwhelmed by the terrifying noise and coordination of a true German armored Blitzkrieg, had broken rank, abandoned their heavy equipment, and fled miles into the desert. In the German High Command, had immediately categorized the American infantrymen. They assessed that while the Americans possessed excellent trucks and an overabundance of rations, they lacked the fundamental psychological architecture required for modern and mechanized warfare. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding the Axis forces in Tunisia, believed the Americans were fundamentally soft. If you hit them with a sudden, violent display of German steel, they would panic and step back. As the sun rose over the Guettar Valley on the morning of March 23rd, von Arnim ordered the 10th Panzer Division to advance. Their mission was simple. Roll into the valley, apply overwhelming psychological and physical pressure, and watch the Americans run again. Before we watch the terrifying reality of what happened when the German war machine slammed into an American line that refused to break, we want to know who is keeping this history alive. And the true story of the Second World War is built on the endurance of ordinary men facing the impossible. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. And if you believe the history of the U.S. Armed Forces needs to be told without Hollywood embellishments, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. The German assault began with textbook precision. Over 50 tanks, and supported by half-tracks and mechanized infantry, throttled forward in a massive wedge formation. The roar of the Maybach engines shook the desert floor. The German commanders stood high in their cupolas, confident, waiting for the inevitable moment when the American line would shatter and the retreat would begin. But as the German armor closed the distance to exactly 4,000 yards, something felt wrong. During the disaster at Kasserine Pass, the American lines had erupted in chaotic, uncoordinated fire the moment the German tanks became visible. The panic had been palpable even from a distance. But today, the valley of Guettar was eerily silent. The Americans were not shooting. They were not running. The men dug into the forward slopes of the valley belonged to the United States 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, commanded by Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen. Unlike the units shattered at Kasserine, the Big Red One had spent the last month absorbing the bitter lessons of defeat. Allen had drilled a singular, absolute directive into his NCOs and infantrymen. Nobody steps back. Nobody yields the high ground. At 3,000 yards, and German tanks were still advancing in complete silence. The German tank commanders began to experience a creeping, localized anxiety. The psychological weapon of the Blitzkrieg relies entirely on the enemy reacting to it. And the enemy simply sits in the dirt and watches you approach. The intimidation factor evaporates, replaced by the terrifying realization that you are driving into a trap. At exactly 6 hours, the trap snapped shut. The silence of the valley was violently shattered, not by the panicked, scattered rifle fire of terrified infantry, but by the perfectly synchronized, thunderous roar of American artillery and M10 tank destroyers. The Americans had deliberately allowed the 10th Panzer Division to drive deep into a pre-planned kill zone. The German-led tanks were instantly engulfed in high-explosive fire. The valley floor turned into a chaotic inferno of burning oil, screaming metal, and blinding sand. According to German doctrine, when an armored assault stalls, the mechanized infantry must dismount, move forward through the smoke, and physically clear the enemy trenches to regain momentum. And the German Panzer Grenadiers poured out of their half-tracks, fixed bayonets, and charged up the slopes toward the American foxholes, expecting the soft Americans to abandon their positions in the face of close-quarters combat. Instead, they ran into a wall of American infantrymen who had made a prior permanent decision. The men of the 1st Infantry Division held their ground. When the German infantry closed to within 50 yards, the American line erupted. Fighting devolved into vicious, brutal combat. When German squads managed to break into the forward American foxholes, the Americans did not fall back to a secondary line. And they drew their trench knives and entrenching tools and fought the elite veterans of the Afrika Korps hand-to-hand in the dirt, a German company commander, attempting to coordinate a flanking maneuver on the right ridge, and radioed his battalion headquarters in sheer disbelief. He reported that the American infantry was absorbing devastating casualties, taking direct fire from 88mm tank guns, and yet they were completely refusing to displace. "And they are not behaving like the troops we fought last month," the German officer shouted over the radio net. "They are taking horrific losses, but they will not give up the crest. We are having to kill them in their holes." By mid-morning, and the pride of the Afrika Korps was burning in the valley. The 10th Panzer Division had lost over 30 tanks. The soft American amateurs had absorbed the absolute heaviest blow the German military could deliver, wiped the blood from their faces, and refused to take a single step backward. The myth of American cowardice had just died in the Tunisian sand. By noon on March 23, 1943, the El Guettar Valley was choked with thick black smoke. The initial morning assault by the elite 10th Panzer Division had been a catastrophic failure. 30 German tanks, representing a massive percentage of the Axis armored strength in North Africa, had been reduced to burning metal husks on the valley floor. Back at the German command post, Major General Friedrich Freiherr von Broich, commander of the 10th Panzer Division, struggled to process the after-action reports. The German tactical framework relied on a specific psychological assumption. If you hit inexperienced troops with enough concentrated armor, their command structure paralyzes and the infantry breaks. But the American 1st Infantry Division had not broken. Instead, they had absorbed the armored shock, engaged the German infantry in brutal close-quarters combat, and held the high ground. To the German high command, accepting this reality was impossible, and they rationalized that the morning's failure was a fluke, a matter of the Americans getting lucky with a concealed minefield and a well-placed ambush. General von Broich determined that the Americans must be exhausted, running low on ammunition, and hanging on to their positions by a thread. He ordered a second, massive assault to commence in the late afternoon. At exactly 16:45 hours, the German war machine throttled up again. But this time, they altered their tactics. During the morning attack, German Panzer Grenadiers had ridden into battle inside armored half-tracks, expecting a rapid breakthrough. Now, realizing the Americans were deeply entrenched on the ridges, the German infantry advanced entirely on foot, spread out in wide formations, walking slowly alongside the surviving Panzer IIIs and IVs. From the commanding heights of the Jebel el Ankh and Jebel el Keda bridges, the men of the Big Red One watched the German infantry step into the dusty valley. And the German officers leading the advance expected to face the scattered, frantic rifle fire of a desperate enemy. They expected the American artillery to be disorganized. What they walked into instead was a masterpiece of mathematical destruction. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, who had recently taken command of the U.S. Second Corps, had drastically reorganized the American defensive doctrine. He demanded absolute discipline and completely overhauled the coordination of the American artillery. And the German infantry advanced across the open plain. They did not meet scattered resistance. They walked into a perfectly orchestrated, continuous wall of high-explosive artillery fire. A surviving German lieutenant from the 10th Panzer Grenadier Regiment later described the psychological terror of that afternoon. "We spread our lines wide to minimize casualties, just as the manual dictates," he reported. But it did not matter, and the American artillery was not firing blindly. They were walking their barrages back and forth across our formations with a mechanical precision. Every time we tried to find cover in a wadi, the artillery adjusted and the earth simply erupted beneath us. And compounding the horror for the advancing German infantry was the presence of the 601st and 776th Tank Destroyer Battalions. Equipped with M10 tank destroyers and M3 half-tracks mounting 75mm guns, the American crews realized that the surviving German tanks were hanging back, using the infantry as a shield. In response, the American tank destroyers aggressively switched their ammunition. Instead of waiting for armored targets, the American M10s leveled their massive guns and began firing high-explosive H shells directly into the advancing lines of German infantry. For the German officers on the ground, the situation rapidly deteriorated from an organized assault into a fight for sheer survival. The core of the Blitzkrieg is momentum. When momentum is lost, the attacking force is caught in the open. The German infantrymen, and pinned down on the dusty valley floor, looked to the high ground. They waited for the moment when the sheer weight of the German attack would force the Americans to displace and pull back. But the Americans did not displace. In Kasserine Pass, the German army had faced boys, but in the Guettar Valley, they were facing men who had made a terrifying psychological transition. The 1st Infantry Division held their foxholes, while German 88mm tank shells shattered the rocks around them. And German squads managed to crawl up the slopes. They were met by American soldiers who refused to yield an inch of dirt, fighting with a cold, mechanical aggression. By dusk, the German assault was completely broken. General von Breuch, in recognizing that his elite division was being systematically bled to death, ordered a general withdrawal. The remnants of the 10th Panzer Division abandoned the valley and retreated toward Gabes, leaving the smoking ruins of their armor behind them. As the sun set over North Africa, a profound and terrifying realization settled over the German officer corps. The easy victories were over. The Americans had learned how to fight, and worse, they had learned how to stand their ground. The morning of March 24, 1943, revealed a valley transformed into an armored graveyard. The 10th Panzer Division, a unit that had struck terror across Europe and North Africa, had been physically gutted. Nearly 40 German tanks and dozens of half-tracks lay scattered across the floor Els blackened and their turrets blown entirely off their chassis. For the German High Command, the loss of the armor was devastating. But it was the loss of the psychological advantage that terrified them most. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, reviewing the catastrophic after-action reports in Tunis, realized that a fundamental shift had occurred in the American command structure. A German intelligence apparatus had spent weeks compiling dossiers on the American leadership following Kasserine Pass. They had noted the lack of discipline, the poor radio security, and the tendency of American units to act independently rather than as a cohesive army. But the enemy that had just broken the 10th Panzer Division did not match that dossier. The German radio intercept operators had noted a drastic change in the American signal traffic leading up to Guettar. The frantic, undisciplined chatter that had characterized the American retreat a month prior was gone. It had been replaced by a cold and standardized, rigidly enforced communication protocol. The artillery fire that had annihilated the German afternoon assault was not the result of panicked men firing blindly. It was the result of a terrifyingly efficient, centralized command. The German officers began to ask a single question: who took control of the United States Second Corps? The answer was Lieutenant General George S. Patton. When Patton assumed command in early March, he recognized exactly what the German High Command had recognized. The American soldier was not soft, but he was disastrously undisciplined. Patton had instituted a regime of absolute uncompromising rigidity. He fined men for not wearing their helmets in the rear. He demanded that every officer led from the front. He forced the infantry to dig deeper, to coordinate their heavy weapons, and above all, and to completely remove the word retreat from their tactical vocabulary. To the German generals, Patton represented a nightmare scenario. The German military philosophy heavily relied on the belief that democracies produced inherently weak, individualistic soldiers who could not submit to the collective discipline required for mechanized war. But Patton had proven that the American industrial giant could, in fact, forge an army just as disciplined and lethal as the Wehrmacht, and do it in less than 30 days. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, a brilliant German tactical analyst who served on the staff of the Panzer Army Africa, and later wrote a devastating post-war assessment of what Guettar actually meant for the Third Reich. He wrote, "At Kasserine, we struck a blow that would have destroyed a lesser army. We believed we had broken their spirit. But at Guettar, we discovered a terrifying resilience. The American soldier is a fast learner. He adapts with a speed that our rigid doctrines cannot match. When commanded by officers who understand the ruthless arithmetic of modern war, and the American infantryman transforms from a civilian into a professional killer almost overnight." A fast learner. That was the fatal miscalculation of the Afrika Korps. The German military machine was built on decades of Prussian tradition. It took years to forge a German Panzer Grenadier. They assumed the Americans would require the same timeline to build a competent fighting force. But the Americans did not have years, so they adapted in weeks. The 1st Infantry Division held the high ground at Guettar. They did more than just win a localized tactical victory. They forced the Axis commanders to look across the Mediterranean Sea and realize that the war of easy victories was permanently over. And the men of the Big Red One had stared down the absolute apex of German military engineering. They had absorbed the deafening roar of the Blitzkrieg, watched the Stuka dive bombers scream out of the sun, and felt the earth shake under the treads of the Panzer Divisions. And when the dust finally settled, the German officers, looking through their binoculars, saw an American army that was still sitting in their foxholes, gripping their rifles, waiting for them to try again. Guettar was the exact moment the German military realized they were not fighting well-equipped amateurs. They were fighting an army of free men who had just learned how to hold the line, and who would soon carry that line all the way to the heart of Germany.